Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's virtual to author discussion with Anna Solomon from the book of V. My name is Alicia, and this is our moderator, Joe, and we both work at Global Citizen and serve as your hosts and moderators this afternoon. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few details. You're currently all in the audience, which means that you will be automatically muted and no one else can hear you. The only people that will be able to hear you is if you're on the stage like Joe and I right now. If you do not wish for anyone to side video chat with you, please select the lock icon on the bottom toolbar of your screen. Also, while you're there, we have a chat box, which I see some of you are engaging with. We want this to be fun and interactive, so please feel free to talk amongst your fellow book club members throughout this event, but please keep it respectful. Throughout this conversation, if you think of a question that you want to ask during the Q&A portion, simply click on the question mark icon and type in your question, and we'll see if we can bring you up at the end of the event. So without further ado, we're going to bring up our guest of honor, Anna Solomon, and kick off with a moderated discussion with Joe. So.
Hey,
Hi, Anna.
Hi, so great to be here with you.
Yeah, we're looking forward
and everybody. Thanks so much for being here.
I'm just going to give a brief introduction of your work and also the Book of V before we get started, if that sounds good.
Great.
Yeah, so Anna Solomon is the author of Leaving Lucy Pear and The Little Bride and a two-time winner of the Pushcart Prize. Her short fiction and essays have appeared in publications including the New York Times Magazine, One Story, Plowshares, Slate, and more. Co-editor with Eleanor Henderson of Labor Day, True Birth Stories by Today's Best Women Writers. Solomon was born and raised in Massachusetts and lives in Brooklyn with her husband and two children. And the Book of V, for all of you who haven't read it, I hope most of you have been able to at least read some of it. It's a really great book. The Book of V is a remarkable novel about three women, Esther, V, and Lily, who carve out spaces of freedom within patriarchal systems. Although they occupy radically different eras, they're bound by similar desires, constrained by similar forces, and ultimately transformed by similar events. The novel explores a range of themes such as death, sexuality, infidelity, friendship, ambition, and feminism. But it's ultimately the close narration of each character's thoughts, every mundane observation, spiraling memory, and competing emotion that brings the novel to life and propels it forward. And yeah, I really enjoyed this book. I thought you did a really excellent job at bridging together these three different characters and these different eras and just bringing it to a really satisfying conclusion and exploring a lot of really thought-provoking themes throughout. So I don't know if there's anything you want to add before we begin.
No, I mean, I'm honored that Global Citizen chose the book as its first fiction pick because it's, you know, a book that I wrote very much in a lot of ways out of, I wouldn't say a narrow window, but in the way that fiction works, you know, a very specific window. And so what you want with fiction is that it becomes more universal and more applicable and work that people are looking at through various lenses. And so I really love the lens that you and your activists and the people here today are coming to it with.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of different just ideas explored in this book. And as you said, it was selected as the book club read for Good Morning America, I believe. So I'm sure they brought their own background to this novel as well. I mean, it has mainstream appeal, but also critical appeal as well. So I guess first off, I just want to get into like the nuts and bolts of how you wrote this book. There are three primary characters that the book explores: Esther, V, and Lily. Their stories alternate as we read. Towards the end of the book, their stories ultimately merge, but they overlap throughout as themes keep popping up and a meta-narrator comments on the unfolding narrative with wry commentary. What was the process of writing the book like? Did you write all the stories at the same time, or did you add in the overlapping themes and motifs in the editing process?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you liked the wry commentary by the narrator. It was a lot of fun to kind of pull that narration off. And Yeah, I did write the book in the order that it's read by the reader. So people ask me this a lot, you know, did I write sort of one character from beginning to end and then another, and then I weave them together? But I instead it starts out, I guess, Lily, and then V, and then Esther, and then I think V next. I can't tell you exactly. It's not always exactly even, but there is kind of a braiding effect. And I knew that I needed to write them in the order they'd be read in order for for the reader to really be able for all of the plot and thematic sort of arcs to be propelled as they needed to be, really, for the story to come together. Like otherwise there would be these huge, I wouldn't have known where to leave the gaps. I wouldn't have known where to tie things together. There are a lot of rhythms and gestures that hold the book together. So there's the plot pieces, and then there's also, as you mentioned, you know, themes, motifs. There's, for instance, a gesture like humming or drinking, various things like this that you'll kind of see toward an end of a chapter, and then it picks up in the next. And they kind of, these pieces that really pulled things together, made them more cohesive. There's certainly some of that happened in editing and revising, but I did try to get as much of it in there on the first go as I could.
Yeah, I really like how you mentioned how the storylines are braided together, because actually one of the recurring motifs is the idea of sewing and sewing things together, and how you're interlacing different colors and to bring together this whole tapestry. And you definitely get that sense with this book. Each chapter is leading into the next chapter, and they're all complementing each other, and it's really well done. But of course, at the root of the whole novel is the story of Esther. So can you talk about how this became the source material, and then how you modernize it to the lives of V and Lily?
Yeah, so I'm Jewish, and I grew up with the story of Esther as part of the holiday Purim, which is this, really, for those who don't know it, very bizarre holiday as far as religious holidays go. It's because the book of Esther is very bizarre. It's actually only one of two books in the entire Bible that don't mention God. And you could argue is very godless. It's very full of sort of sex and drinking and licentiousness and body jokes, and, you know, really doesn't feel, and the holidays like that too. There's this big pageant. There's the adults in the room are commanded to get so drunk that they can't tell the difference between the hero and the villain. So it's really a carnival holiday, and carnival in the sense that it's about turning order upside down, turning the actual order, in which case, you know, like Jews were not on top, flipping that. And so that by the end they come out on top, and the Persian king is, you know, is humbled, and the evil villain, whose name is Haman, is killed, which isn't giving that much away, I think, but certainly not in my book. So anyway, this story as a girl, it was very intriguing to me. And then, and I always had this question, because at the very beginning of the book, before Esther comes, Esther's the hero of the book of Esther, there's this first queen named Queen Vashti, who is asked at the very beginning of the book to come before her husband and his friends. And the interpretation has always been that he was asking her to come naked, because the language is in her crown, meaning only in her crown. And she refuses, and she's banished. And, you know, that's sort of the very beginning. So the play, when I was a little girl, I would watch, and the fellow members of the congregation would be playing this out. And whoever played Vashti was either dressed like as a prostitute, or sometimes as a leper, which have been common interpretations of what was wrong with her. And then they're banished. She's banished. And it wasn't until later that I looked at this story again, because my kids had been given books of it, and was thinking, well, wait a second. I don't understand why, if she says, no, I don't want to parade naked in front of you and your friends, that makes her the wanton one, or her, you know, and oh, wait a second. When you really read this story, Esther, who's sort of who always comes across, she's the heroine, she's the virtuous one, is actually a concubine in a harem. No one ever told me that either. So it kind of brought me back into the story, and it made me want to read the story really for the first time in its original form. I had never done that. So anyway, long story short, I think I became very interested in how many aspects of the story are very relevant and contemporary, and are really about, you know, in a very concrete sense, sort of the trafficking and enslavement of women. And I think more broadly, the precariousness of women's right to choose and control our own bodies, which of course is something that has not changed in a lot of ways. In a lot of ways it has. We can see that. And then we can also see very clearly what is going on in Texas and in many other states in our country. We can see what's going on in Afghanistan. It's not difficult to kind of look almost in any direction and find that we are still very much fighting this fight.
Yeah, I found it very interesting in the story of Esther. She's initially put in this holding space with the 40 other women, and they're just like prevented from going outside the castle or outside of the walls of the space they're in, and they're under constant surveillance. And then when she's elevated to queen, she's just in a more luxurious version of that. So she never actually gains any freedom. She's constantly under surveillance. She's very restricted in what she does. And you see that again in V's story. While she's in the mansion that she paid for with her family money, with her husband, she's under a lot of tight control, and then she's banished, like Vashti was banished. And then obviously we don't see the same sort of banishment in the most modern story, but we do get some of the grappling with some of the same themes and some of the same ideas about how women are restricted. So this brings me to my next question. Nowadays, we see down with the patriarchy on a lot of t-shirts and hats, and our understanding of the patriarchal system is much more sophisticated and self-aware than it has been in the past. There's a lot more scholarship around it and a lot more public understanding around how we live within a patriarchy. So I was wondering, as you were writing this book, did you deliberately make patriarchy writ large the chief antagonist, or did that happen just as you were writing the lives of these women and they're living within this system?
Yeah, I love the way you phrase that, you know, like as the chief antagonist is patriarchy writ large. And I think that's right. That's what happens in the book. It wasn't where I started from, or it wasn't what I don't tend to write at the beginning from a place of like idea. Here's what I want to say. I write from character, from story, from questions, really. Like, what are my questions here? What am I confused about? What am I provoked by? What am I angry about? What do I not understand? And I'm sort of seeking through writing to understand it better. That said, and I think this goes back to your first question too, about sort of how the book was constructed. As I revised and rewrote and rewrote and rewrote, which is a lot, you know, a lot of the writing process is the rewriting and thinking critically about something that you know, kind of created in a creative mode, you know, sort of going back and forth between the creative and the analytical. I did come to recognize like, oh, this is about patriarchy writ large. And so part of that process is taking that theme and those questions and kind of bringing them into control. And in my mind, and never wanting it to feel didactic or, you know, hitting people over the head, but having it very much present and manifest, which is the beauty to me of fiction, is that it can be in the dramatic action itself and not, it's different than an essay. That's what makes it different, right? Or a polemic. So yes and no.
There's this really remarkable moment in the book where you bring in magical realism in the story of Esther. She's about to be, she's about to be, I guess, raped by the king because it's against her will. And she turns into a monster. She turns into a creature with large paddle hands and very large, and she has claws. And she terrifies the king, and then the king's minister comes in and attacks her and subdues her. And I read it as this was a metaphor for whenever a woman tries to assert herself, there's this violent backlash by the patriarchy. I was wondering, is this a fair reading? And what was it like bringing magical realism into the book?
Yeah. No, it is a fair reading. And I think that I think it's that idea of sort of the way that a woman doing that appears, right? Like as a beast or as a monster to the patriarchy, as you're saying. I think that is a fair reading. I think that I thought about it, or I was writing from a place, because I was writing from her point of view, thinking less about sort of how she was seen, although I think that that's exactly right, what you're saying, and more about what drove her to how utterly trapped she felt, that she was driven to try in order to get out of the situation which she was in, to like literally escape herself. and to become other than she was. And it doesn't work in the end, but it's that is where it comes from. I think that there's also, in terms of writing fantasy into the book more broadly, I've been interested in this for a very long time. And actually, like, way back when I was an undergrad, wrote my thesis about sort of women using fantasy in fiction, which I think I thought I forgot about for decades. And then here I was doing this. But I think that, fantasy has a lot of power, a real power. And I think that and many other people, I'm not the first to say this, would argue that to fantasize is to take action, is to start to take action, to imagine, right? And that it's often in these imaginings that nothing would happen if we didn't imagine in the first place. I think everybody here today probably knows that, right? And when it comes to change, and especially radical change, it does take imagining things first. And a lot of the time, things that people would say to you, like, that can't possibly happen. And so I think that there's a lot of power in introducing and allowing for the uses of fantasy, both in fiction and also in our own lives.
Yeah, I love the way you describe that, as any change begins first with the imagination. And if we have the courage to imagine a different possibility, a different future. So Esther really gets into doing magic, which is something that she has from her mother's side of the family, even though it's in a diluted form in her because it wasn't really passed down. But as she, sorry about the sirens, I don't know if you could hear that. But as she's beginning to do magic more, the minister picks up on it, and he demands that she teaches him magic as well. And she has this thought where she's just going to draw out the magic lessons, and they're just going to circle around doing magic indefinitely and never actually get anywhere. And this struck me as central to the novel itself and some of the problems facing the women. Women's rights have advanced substantially over the past several thousand years, of course, but the patriarchal system still persists, and many feminist victories, as a woman at one of V's house parties says, are often symbolic and stifle deeper structural change. So as a result, there's this sense that have things really changed that much, as you said earlier? The characters, for example, are all mired in this forced domesticity, whether it's caregiving, doing laundry, applying makeup, or preparing meals, and they're subsumed in the lives of men, usually their husbands. Can you elaborate a bit more on how you perceive the dichotomy of this circularity, or the sense of going nowhere and progress?
Yeah. And I just want to say, I love that reading, the way that you read into, the way when she is teaching the king magic and sort of taking him around in circles with the idea that, like, I'm never going to really get you there. I'm just going to have you think that you're getting somewhere, which you're right. It's sort of the same. There's that corollary. And what the reference you're pointing to at the party in Washington, D.C. in 1973 is the women talking about the Equal Rights Amendment, and sort of whether it will in fact, which it of course, I don't know if everybody here knows the Equal Rights Amendment never passed. We still don't have an Equal Rights Amendment in this country, but whether it would in fact mean real change, or whether it would just sort of itself be this symbolic thing that served to get women to shut up about it. So yeah, I think that these are, I think it's impossible. Real progress has obviously happened in very important ways. In legally, I think most legally, financially, politically, like, big things have happened that are real and that are really important, and they've happened all over the world. At the same time, I think there are a lot of ways in which progress can be insidious, in that it can sort of persuade us not to see how much work remains. And I think one of the things that I'm really exploring in this book is not just the ways that I, already touched on about, what's going on, again, like all over the world, Afghanistan, here, to limit women's lives and choices in very concrete ways, but what happens inside and on a daily basis in people's lives, and not just women, men too. And this is really, to me, about the sort of way in which we're socialized in our families and our culture, and often by stories, which to me is where the power of, I obviously believe in the power of story because I write stories, but, the stories that we are told have so much power to shape the way we conceive of ourselves and the way that we relate with other people. And it's there, I think, that we have the furthest to go in a lot of ways. And I was thinking about this, bear with me for a second, because I was watching recently 2 shows, or movies, I guess. One was a show, one was a movie, that really brought this up for me. And because they're both shows that were sort of lauded, and I liked both of them very much, but lauded as being very progressive and doing things that shows hadn't done before. And one was the show, the movie, I think it's The Mitchells versus the Machine. I don't know if you've seen this, but it's like, it's a family cartoon. Maya Rudolph's in it, and it's got this family and these two kids. And it turns out, like, at the end, there's this great reference to the daughter being gay that's not made a big deal of. And like, there are all these ways in which it does great stuff that feels new and important. But afterward, I was like, but the mother, like the relationship between the couple, I'm interested in what you think. Like, she literally does all the emotional labor for her husband down to him being a father. Like, she's like, let me help you be a good, and there's nothing given back to her. It's like this very prime example of the kinds of things I'm writing about in this book. And so I think, well, my kids watch this movie, they come away being like, that, yay, 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 like, yay for this, yay for that. But like, they're taking in these stories in which the man is this hapless doofus, and she just kind of helps him, like props him up so that he can still do his job. And the other one was actually this great show called The Chair, which just came out with Sandra Oh, and great show, like doing all sorts of really, I think, important things. And at the same time, I was like watching I forget the name of the actor who plays the male professor who does this stupid thing about Hitler. And then he's a novelist, of course, and he's all scruffy and, and he's very charming. And there's these scenes of him. And I'm like, if you put a woman in this role, no one would ever buy it. No one would allow for it. And no one would consider it sexy or charming, which is how you're clearly expected to find it with this man. So anyway, I guess this is all to say, not to go off on total tangent, but I've been thinking a lot about this. And I think it comes back to this question of like, where are we now? How circular is it? And that like these stories are still built so firmly into the way that we are living and the stories that we're told that they're really the hardest ones to break out of. I guess that was a very long answer, but I've been thinking a lot about these shows, and I was very frustrated.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought all that up. Patriarchy, since it is the system we live in, it's often invisible. The effect it has on us, or we're not always aware of it. It's kind of like the air we breathe because it's so pervasive. And of course, one of the core tenets of patriarchy is that women have to play caregiving roles for men, and obviously in our society that's still very prevalent and hasn't really been challenged to a great degree. And your book, of course, explores this to a large extent. Another aspect of the book is that all of the protagonists are orphans, whether we meet them when they're orphans or one of their parents dies along the way. And that seems to provide them with a sort of detached objectivity that allows them to really analyze what's going on from a much more critical perspective. And I was wondering, did this decision about them being orphaned come about intentionally? Is it integral to the book, or did it just happen incidentally?
Well, it grows very much out of the original book of Esther, because Esther is an orphan, and her orphanness is a key part of her circumstances and her plot, right? Because she lives with her uncle and her aunt, and she's unprotected in a sense. And so my choice to have the other characters orphans was in some way in relationship to that. Although Vivian Barr is also an orphan by the time we meet her. I think that in some ways, what I was doing with it was really pushing, and for Lily, whose mother dies in the course of the book, which I think is okay to say here, that her becoming an orphan, of course, in her 40s, so you can't know if you really call her an orphan, but it's sort of a banishment from her childhood. It's forcing her quite belatedly in some ways to grow up and to be pushed out of living her life only in relationship to her mother. And so I think I was interested for all of them in playing with the ways in which their lack of parents both causes them pain, but it also sort of forces them into defining their lives in the way that feels true to them, and not via the expectations that were given to them. So it's sort of a pushing them off a cliff.
One of the, from a just contemporary perspective, one of the most interesting parts of the book is that it's taking place as Donald Trump is beginning his candidacy for president, and the book treats it derisively, like this is never going to happen. And that's, of course, how a lot of us felt at the time. Seemed like a ridiculous ploy. So I was wondering, of course, if we're back in the universe of the book, what would Lily think about his victory? And it seems a lot like a Donald Trump presidency parallels one of the old kingships of the past, in which you have this utterly petulant person who is just on a permanent ego trip. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I was writing it before, I started writing it before the election, and I was still writing it after the election. And so it was very important at that point to set it early in 2016 to allow for that kind of the innocence and the naivete to come across. But as a writer, by then knew what was coming. And I mean, I think that Lily's reaction would be sort of what mine was, which was shock and heartbreak and anger and humiliation and many other things along those lines. I think that one thing I've come to see very much since I experienced that was how much my response was also rooted in my whiteness, because and how many people around me weren't having the shock that I was having, because in fact this was not unprecedented, which in fact belongs very much with the book that I was writing. Like I knew this on some level because I was writing, oh, this has happened before, but at the same time, I had been lulled, I think, very much via my own privilege into just feeling that this could not happen. And so that's something that I've really, I think my consciousness of that, and that being very particular to not Lily, but white people, has shifted a lot in the last few years.
Yeah, if you really zoom out and take a large sweep of history, there's really, Donald Trump seems to be the quintessential American president in a lot of ways. One of the things that the book explores, especially towards the end, is the veracity of history and whether we can ever be sure if the history we're told is accurate. And history is determined by who controls power at a time in society, and they get to shape the stories that we're told. They get to suppress other stories. So this has always been a very prominent theme in novels throughout history, but it seems especially urgent today in this post-truth, fake news world that we're living in. And I know this is a very challenging question, but I'm curious about your thoughts. How do we get history right? Is there anything that we can do to make sure that the history that we're collectively creating is accurate?
Yeah, it is a big question. I mean, I will try to keep writing stories that sort of turn over the public version and see what's underneath. But I think for all of us, I think in a public sense, I think I have two parts of this answer, which is in a public sense, and you're talking, I think that we all, and this may sound, it's one of these things you hear a lot, but I think it can't be overstated how important it is to support local news and news organizations that are happening on a very small scale, but that are in fact reaching the people who need to be reached and who are otherwise going to be reached by fake news. I think along with that, the kind of advocacy and activism that a lot of people here today are doing is critical. And I think working to really amplify and connect with the voices of people who have been silenced is really critical, because that's where this, I mean, again, it's all about history and story are the same, right? It's like these are the stories that have been silenced. That's the same thing as the history that hasn't been told. And then I think to come back to what I was saying about so much happening in sort of in our daily lives, I think on the private sphere, the more we can listen, the better, and the more we can be, I think, vulnerable with each other and with the people in our lives, which is, it sounds kind of woo-woo, but I think it's really the building blocks of opening up and getting clearer about what's actually happening to the people, who are close to us. Helps us get clearer and be more open to what may have happened and what may still be happening to people who may not look like us or live lives like us, and who need us to actually pay attention.
Yeah, to bring it,
a very big question.
to bring it full circle, Lily seems to be engaging in some of that vulnerability and truth-seeking at the end of the book when she picks up where her mother left off and really engages with the story of Esther in a really deep way for the first time, when she's really looking at the scholarship around it and understanding how complex, convoluted, and difficult this story is, and how it's really about what shreds from the past can we resurrect, and how can we rehabilitate this story from maybe some of the more distorted versions that we've been told. Yeah, I really enjoyed this book. I took so many notes throughout. It really provoked a lot of thoughts, and it made me think deeply about a lot of issues. So I appreciate that you wrote it. Thank you so much. I hope that we have some questions from the audience. I think Alicia is now going to open it up.
I need to plug in my computer, so hang on. I'll be right back. Sorry. Okay. I didn't realize I was running out of power.
Okay. So yes, we are now on the Q&A portion of our event. Thank you for that thoughtful discussion. I hope that has sparked some questions on people's minds. So to submit your question, please hit the question mark icon on the bottom of your screen, and we'll bring you up on stage one by one to ask Anna yourself. So start sending your text messages in now. But I know we have one person. I just need to find them. Okay, I'm going to bring Lena up on stage.
Hi there, can you guys hear me? Oh, perfect. Yeah, so my question is, do you see yourself in any of the characters? And if so, which one?
I think I'd say I'd see them myself in all of them in different ways. I mean, it's, you know, everybody assumes I'm sort of the most obviously like Lily on paper. But in a lot of ways, I think that I share a lot of instincts as V, and in some ways her character was easier for me to write than the others, I think, because of that.
Great, cool, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I've got a new perspective by reading this book, but there are too many people criticize to retelling old stories with the modern perspectives. For example, to spin out a woman from the biblical story as a modern day feminist. I wonder, how do you respond to these reviews?
You mean how do I respond to people who criticize the idea of bringing the old biblical stories to modernizing them?
Yes.
Yeah, and there are people who do feel that way. I think that, you know, there are obviously many people who still feel, well, like, see these stories in a very fundamental and fundamentalist way, right? Like this is literally what happened, and who are you to play with it? And who are you to, you know, they might see it as, oh my gosh, what's the word I'm thinking of? It'll come.
Sacrilegious or something?
Sacrilegious, yeah, there's another specific word, but they might see it as sacrilegious, exactly. And my feeling is that, or what I say is that these stories have always been very much alive and very much open to interpretation. And it's true that for thousands of years, the people doing that, most of that interpreting, were men. And in this tradition, in these stories, they were often Jewish, you know, they were like the rabbis, right? So those interpretations were seen as legitimate. But if you go back to them, a lot of them are actually really wild, and they really take huge liberties with bringing in all sorts of things that aren't in the story itself. And so part of how I respond is by saying people have actually been doing this kind of interpretive work since these stories were written. And so this is actually nothing new. And the other way I guess I could respond and will respond is just sort of, if they're not alive, they should be. Like we all need to be continually kind of retelling and bringing stories up to date if we're going to find their relevance in our lives now. Because otherwise, I think these stories will become dead. So I think it's the way that we keep stories alive.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
Oh, I think heretical was the word you were looking for.
It wasn't that either, but that's another, it was a verb. That's where I was, and it wasn't bastardize. It was something like bastardize. Anyway.
I'm stepping in for our last question. One of our guests has a question, but they're having trouble with their connection. So Kathy has the question of, why is it called the Book of V?
Great question. So really originally it's very simply called the Book of V because it's Vashti. My goal at the beginning was to take this banished queen who's never heard from again and whose story hasn't been told and tell it. And so it was sort of concretely about her. And then I have these other Vashti characters throughout the book, in like Vivian Barr in the 1970s and like Vera, Adam's first wife, in the contemporary story. But I think more broadly, I also and the reason it stays sort of V instead of the Book of Vashti was really about allowing it to speak to women more broadly, and to encompass them more broadly. People, I will just say, because I'm sure it's out there in everyone's minds, people often ask, is it vagina? And I'm totally fine with that interpretation. Great, but it wasn't intended in that way. But certainly I wasn't unconscious that it could be interpreted in that way. It's not shocking to me, like, oh my God, I can't believe people would think of the word vagina. So I don't know if that answers the question, but.
It does. Actually, Kathy was wondering the same thing. So that's very interesting. You touched on that point.
It's right there, the elephant in the room, right? Or yeah, we could use another word. But anyway, go ahead.
Actually, I think I have another question, so I'm bringing them on stage.
I'm hearing clicking.
Hello, I'm sorry. Hi, my name is Micah. Ask you that first.
Hi. Oh, now I can't hear you.
Oh, okay.
Oh, now I can. Go ahead.
Okay, so my question actually is, I wanted to ask, how do you do your research to prepare to write a book about a social problem that is as big as the patriarchy? So that's something I'm really interested in. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you for being here. Well, first of all, I think you don't start by thinking I'm going to research patriarchy, because there would be no way, right? So I think it's sort of going back, like you need to start small. I mean, depending on, again, with fiction, the research really grows out of the story and grows out of the characters. And so, and I think it's important. This is the same with nonfiction to a large degree. But you're trying to figure out, in fiction at least, what do part of the research that I do informs the story. It changes the story, part of what I learn. And also what I learn drives the research that I do. So it's a very symbiotic process. So, but again, I didn't start from a place of like, I'm going to write a book about the patriarchy. What do I need to know? I started from a place of, I need to learn about 1970s, Nixon era, Watergate, what was going on. Oh, there's Martha Mitchell, fascinating figure, who was, in part of a wife of someone in the Nixon administration. Oh, here's some of the fiction that was being written at this time. Like here's Margaret Atwood's first novel that came out, and this is what women were reading at this time. And some men, or a book like The Women's Room, which came out during that time. So really kind of immersing myself in both the history and like reading the National Enquirers from that year, which plays a role in the book, but also taught me so much. I mean, there's nothing like looking at advertisements from a given time period to really dig into the psyche, like what was happening. And then more, the contemporary one was in some ways easier because I'm living in it. So I knew what was happening very much. And with the ancient Persia part of what was really interesting was discovering how little was known, and that so much of what was known, like when you look for like, Jews in ancient Persia, everything leads you back to the Book of Esther, which was seen as a book of history. And so that kind of gave me a lot of freedom to play. And what I wound up doing was actually really reading into the both traditional, conventional, I would say patriarchal interpretations of the book, but then also reading a lot of the scholars, the feminist scholars who have written about that story and kind of analyzed every line in a different light. And then also the poems and sort of manifestos that have been written out of it as well. So many different, I think a lot of it is, whenever I research anything, I guess I would say, I feel like I'm joining a conversation that's already been had. And my job at first is to figure out like what's already being said, what's been made out of this, and sort of discovering, you know, if you walk into a room, you don't immediately start talking in the group, you're sort of listening, like what's already here. So it's kind of like that. I don't know if that's at all helpful.
It definitely was. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think that wraps up our Q&A portion, but this has been a great discussion, and I appreciate your time today. Anna, do you have any closing remarks for us?
No, it's been a pleasure. These have been great questions. Joe, I'm so grateful to you for your very close reading. You're a stellar fiction reader, and I'm appreciative, and I'm really appreciative to Global Citizen for choosing the book. And I hope that everyone out there, it's really fun to see people from so many places. I will say that. And just to be kind of like, I feel like often I don't get to participate in events where people are coming from so many parts of the world. So I'm really, really grateful for that. And I hope that everybody stays safe and as well as possible, and that we can, you know, connect in the future in some way.
All right. Thank you. Okay, guys, that wraps up our event today. I hope you had a great time. Thank you, everyone, for joining and reading along the Book of V by Anna Solomon in the month of August. I'm happy to announce when you join this event, you're the first one to know what the next book is, and it's The End of Bias by Jessica Nordell, The Science and Practice of Overcoming Unconscious Bias. Just like you did before, get your hands on a copy of the book, join our discussion in our Facebook group, Global Citizen All Access, and enter to attend our virtual discussion with our author herself in November. We look forward to seeing you all there. You can leave this discussion by simply closing out of the webpage, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.